Today, I'm going to be reviewing Revenge of the Tipping Point, Malcolm Gladwell. So if you're not familiar with Malcolm Gladwell, he writes a lot of different books, and typically what they have is let's say a couple different stories or situations, and he tends to look at how were they caused or how did they occur, what were the major factors that resulted as, a following event of that kind of thing, and also just a very deep look at why do things like this in general happen. So if I had to summarize his writing style, it's something that really makes you think in a little bit of a different way and connect things differently. And it makes you start to question why things happen when you typically don't question it. And he also has a lot of data and, hard evidence to back things up when he says it, which is really great. You may not think that this is really a self-improvement kind of book, and you're like, Ryan, out of all the other books, you still need to read, why would you be reading this one? But I think that it's actually a very good one to open your perspective and see that a lot of times in the world, there's kind of a hidden fabric of how things are functioning. And this just kind of widens our eyes to that reality. So I'm going to go over a little bit of my notes and my big takeaways from this book. It was definitely a very interesting book. I really enjoyed it. So he starts off talking about how a lot of variation that we see in our behavior comes directly from our environment. And I'm talking literally our physical environment, okay? And a big takeaway is that the environment will influence us to these subconscious levels that we're really not aware of and that we can't even imagine them affecting us. So one example he had would certain doctors, they will use a certain way to treat a patient for a certain condition. And different doctors will do things differently. Of course, they're both safe, but it's just preference. But one area of the US, doctors tend to, let's say, do procedure A more versus procedure B. Versus another place, they do the opposite. They do procedure B more and then instead of procedure A. So they found that when a doctor moved from a place where typically they did the A more than the B and moved to where there's more B than the A, even though the hospital never explicitly told them you can only do B and no one forced them to do anything, they just automatically very quickly switched into just doing the opposite procedure more often. And this just becomes from the fact of their environment and the surrounding influences that cause them to have this behavior shift. So I think it's just such a big highlighter of the reality that your environment is so important. I talk about this again and again and again. It's going to affect you in all these ways that you can't even physically comprehend. And you may not even know all the downstream implications of how it's changing your very nature with things that you can't even really observe and only that other people can see. So I think that was a really, really big, eye-opening story that he first starts off with, right? Then another thing is then he goes into a little bit of insurance scandals and how somebody coming from a very, religious, very strong, morally kind of family, all of a sudden started doing, a lot of insurance fraud. So this person came from the middle of the US, then they went to Miami, and then they had started doing a lot of insurance fraud, and that is partly due to the fact of the environment. Of course, this person made their own choices. But I think it also shows that a lot of people will buckle and lose their morals when, they're given these positions of power and there's a lot of illegal opportunities to make money. And that's one thing that you have to watch out on your way to success is that a lot of people achieve success through different means. Some do it quote unquote the correct way, but some people just do terrible things and they make money. And that's, in my opinion, not something you should do. Of course, everyone has their own way to see that, but that's just kind of how I personally see it. Yeah. And I also think one part it highlighted, right, is how this idea of a monoculture. Monoculture is when you are surrounding yourself with people who are exactly the same. And I don't mean exactly, but I'm saying pretty much the same. So it could be you surround yourself with only people of one race. You surround yourself, with only people of one profession, or even more narrow, really just high achievers. So there's problems that occur with that. And it just says that excessively surrounding yourself with people who are the same causes a lot of problems. And diversity in all aspects is important. Because when you build a monoculture and you surround yourself with people similar to you, you lose resilience to different situations because you're simply not exposed to the other, opinions, other people, other situations, because you're just surrounding yourself with one thing all the time. And this can eventually become actually a weakness. So this is why it's always good to keep meeting new people and keep broadening your social circle, because by doing this, you'll be able to like combat this idea of only surround yourself with people who think one type of way. And obviously, if you look at history, that can be a very dangerous thing, right? So you always want to have outside perspective. You don't have to necessarily listen to outside perspective, but at least hearing it can make you just at least have a good outside view on how you're thinking. So the whole book is about the tipping point. And really, the tipping point is the idea that it's going to lead to a change in the status quo, and that will occur when we have an outside group that becomes 33% present. What does this mean? Tipping points is like when things go from just being a like thing that some people do to now all of a sudden everybody's doing it. And what they found time and time again is that when you have about 1/3 of people who start to do this activity, maybe this trend or this thing that goes viral, then it starts to just like spread like wildfire to the rest of things. Of course, he's using a lot of examples before, but it's the same exact thing, right? And then from a social engineering perspective, if you want to stop certain tipping points from happening, if you want to stop a movement from occurring, you have to like limit this group's impact, limit the group's present, just how many of them there are, to like less than 15%. And that will allow the majority, 85%, to kind of keep the 15%. And we're talking mainly about people here in sort of like a subservient state where they're just afraid, they're scared, or they're just, not feeling fully comfortable to speak their opinions and voices. So there's a lot of like bad consequences that can happen with this. And he also uses a example of Harvard and how Harvard's admission system, because of the fact that initially they wanted to keep out a certain group of people, or they wanted to like limit the admission for a certain group of people when Harvard first started. So they used college athletics as a way to recruit additional people of a very specific race that they wanted more of. And that allowed there to keep certain races in the minority, which is defined here as around like 15%. And you can actually see today that there is not necessarily a balanced distribution, and nor should there be a balanced distribution. But I think that the thing people need to understand is that the distribution is not like, it's not unbalanced because of like just like Harvard just letting whatever happen to it. As in, like, they're not just letting whoever applies and whoever's smart enough get in. There is a little bit of them, like, manipulating things behind the scenes. And you'll see that by there still being a majority of a certain kind of race at a lot of these top institutions. And so what the book was comparing that to Caltech. Caltech is another really top school, but their fundamental kind of bottom line is just you just have to be smart enough. And so as a result, you can have a lot larger minorities, like potentially Asians, that will go to Caltech. And now, as of a couple of years ago, they make up 45% of the population of Caltech. But that is considered a minority when you look at the Harvard pool. And that just shows how there's more, intense, very purposeful manipulation of like social engineering this way to prevent, quote unquote, a takeover of a certain other minority. So that was very eye-opening for me, something I did not realize too. And then it transitions on to just kind of like a example about smog and cars, and how just a couple cars cause like most of the smog that we see because they don't have certain licensing. They haven't really got their smog checks. And that just really highlights the fact that the bulk of problems sometimes are created just by a few people. And they can have a lot of far-reaching impacts, right? And later on, we'll talk a lot about kind of like pain prescriptions and things like that. And that's something that there was just a few doctors who had kind of, sold their morals and were prescribing just heinous amounts of painkillers to everybody. And it was just those couple doctors, and that was enough to, cause an entire opioid epidemic in the US, right? Then we also talk about COVID in the book. So Malcolm Gladwell talks about how there's actually the idea of super spreaders and how each person doesn't spread COVID exactly the same. And as a result of that, you have certain people who can spread it to like thousands and thousands of people, and other people who like they'll cough or they'll talk and nothing will really be spread. Also, an interesting fact is that being dehydrated can lead to, much more disease being spread because of the aerosol particles and how your vocal cords are. So if they're less hydrated, the way your like kind of water vapor that comes out of your mouth splits into different particles is different, and it causes there to be more like, virus particles in the air than if you're like drinking more water. One big generalization I took away from this is that widespread changes result from small changes that have unintended consequences. To accurately predict these consequences ahead of time, you must thoroughly analyze all the possible downstream effects of an action and then consider how others will react to the change, as they may not be stagnant and they'll likely shift their opinion and actions. This really comes from the fact that, he covered a lot of the Purdue Pharma OxyContin huge scandal that happened in the US. So pretty much there was this pharma company, they made painkillers, they started pushing all the doctors to prescribe them. What ended up happening is there's a lot of doctors prescribing them, but there were a couple that were just prescribing them like crazy, like, thousands and thousands and thousands of prescriptions. And what happened is you create this huge dependence on these drugs for a lot of people. And so in order to deal with these claims, the company was saying, okay, what we're going to do? We're going to change our medication. Instead of being a tablet, which can be, broken up into smaller pieces and crushed, and people were doing, a lot of like inappropriate things with that, then we're going to make a gummy. And that, or like, not a gummy, but like something like that, right? Where you can't crush it. The problem that they didn't realize was that when they made the gummy, it wasn't able to be abused as much, which is great, but it caused other people to go find other drugs that are abusable. And the issue with that is a lot of these drugs like heroin, fentanyl, they're in these markets that are very unregulated, aka they're illegal, right? So they're in the illegal like black market in a sense. And because of that, you have no quality control. You're at the mercy of whoever's making it. Versus if you're in a company that's, fraudulent and doing a lot of illegal things, at least it's a company. At least it's a healthcare company that's under the regulation of the US government and could be, regulated and controlled and limited. So as a result, they had thought that they would make it better by making this gummy where people can't abuse it, but they actually made it much worse, and it drove tons and tons of people into very much harder, much, more dangerous and much more addicting drugs as a result to kind of fulfill that need. So I think that was one big example for me is like when you make a decision that's like pretty important, you really need to think about all the downstream consequences it's going to have and try to anticipate too, if those downstream consequences are going to like change your life, how that can affect other things in your life too. Because it's not just like a one and done effect. There's typically a domino because one thing will lead to another, and you need to kind of see how far down the line you're going to go and how many different effects there could be, and try to get an idea of what that's going to mean for your future, et cetera, versus just saying, oh, it's going to just do one thing that's going to be better. Like they did in this case where they're just like, oh, if I make it a non-crushable pill, it's going to be better. And they thought it would, but in reality it wasn't. And so that's the summary of the book, Revenge of the Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell. To be honest, if you want to read it, sure. It's just a bunch of stories. You can probably just get like a recommendation of it. I say it would open your mind a lot in like different ways. It's not really trying to tell you much. Like it's not forcing an idea down your throat. There was also this thing about like bank robberies and how certain bank robbers became more famous than other ones too. But I think it's just a really interesting one to kind of broaden your idea to like, okay, how do certain things work in this world? How are they spread? How are they, just passed on? How trends work? And so that was a really cool part that I took away from that. But yeah, if you have any questions, put them down below. Otherwise, make sure you subscribe for more videos like this, and I'll see you in the next one.